Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Andrew. I'm really happy to be here. So much work has been done on popular occult culture over the last couple of years, and I think Andrew and Christine probably is for the start of the conference. If we can just give them a hand. I'm sorry. This kind of the work I was doing and have been doing in the U.S. Started when Christine started it, and is going strong because of her and Andrew. So I'm just really pleased to be able to be a part of it and to be asked to come out here and talk on my work. My talk today is me trying to unravel a kind of a little theoretical conundrum that I've been working on for the last while. And that's the difficulty with pagan feminisms and their kind of essentialist element. And so what I'm looking at in this talk, in the 12 or so pages that I have here today, is looking at a few different authors a bit more closely to see whether they offer any opportunities for thinking outside of kind of a binaristic model of the essential female and the essential male. The popular British neo-pagan movement was a cultural and spiritual phenomena that ran from roughly 1870 to 1930. It was called the Neo-Pagan movement or the New Paganism. Predominantly engaged with pantheism and characterized by respect for and or worship of nature or certain of its elements. Neo-paganism was also shaped by other contemporary interrogations of the status quo, including the suffrage and women's rights movements, increased interest in female-driven occult practices such as spiritualism and Theosophy, and post-Darwinian conceptions of women's relationships to nature. British neo-pagans offered vibrant new perspectives for addressing the chafing limits of conventional gender identity models. And this morning I wish to consider how neo-paganism, its non-anthropocentric interests, contributed to a burgeoning eco-feminism on less conventionally heteronormative terms. More specifically, in my talk, I want to engage works by various contributors to neo-paganism, such as Moina Mathers, Vernon Lee, and Fiona McLeod primarily, to suggest a variety of ways in which notions of women's relation to nature were used to interrogate trans-species arguments into the broader feminist debates of the period. The argument that women are innately closer to nature than men had been put into practice as early as Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindications of the Rights of Women, in which she proposes that such claims are the product of a social and professional system structured to devalue and disempower women. Barbara Gates observes that, making a big temporal leap, by the end of the 19th century, this kind of biological determinism was so widespread that it can even be it can even serve as an index to an entire set of discourses that typify Victorian and later Edwardian culture in terms of gender definition. The womanizing of nature and naturizing of women, as Connie Bullis puts it, was being engaged by feminists and anti-feminists, suffrage and anti-suffrage campaigners alike. The conflation of women with nature stood in apparent conflict with the equally common depiction of them as inherently domestic and by extension disconnected from a wilderness, demanding assumedly masculine qualities of self-reliance, combativeness, physical strength. The two models are consistent, however, in leaving binary gender logic intact, and it's this logic that I wish to focus on today. Paganism has contributed to this homogenizing paradigm, often idealizing images of women or images of universal earth goddesses or visions of the planet itself as a woman. At the same time, however, paganism's veneration of the earth and its elements also urges a decentering of the human, and this encourages more fluid approaches to gender. Pagan ecofeminist Val Plumwood has recently called for a countercentric philosophical animism that avoids the dualism of nature versus human or versus science or versus culture, binaries that position women as neither fully human nor fully natural. She focuses on a set of ethical stances which can help to minimize the influence of the oppressive ideologies of domination and self-imposition that have formed our conception of both the other and ourselves. Turning for her examples to environmentally responsible paganisms, she advocates for an eco-spirituality supporting a, quote, interspecies communicative ethic that sustains awareness not only of humans' dependence on non-humans, but also men's dependence on women, all the while avoiding both hierarchies of sentient beings and inspirations of immortality or otherworldly fulfillment. Greta Gard has argued, however, that while ecofeminisms such as Plumwood's will mention queer issues among a list of oppressions, the contribution that queerness can make to the theoretical framework itself has been ignored. Challenging the very invention of species categories, queer ecology addresses organisms' desires not only in relation to others of their species, but throughout the network of the organic world. The emphasis is on interaction rather than some notion of independent singular entities choosing the direction of their affections. This focus on relations rather than entities foregrounds the view, as articulated by Catriona Mortimer and Bruce Erickson, that sexual politics is also an environmental politics that demonstrates an understanding of the ways in which sexual relations organize and influence both the material world of nature and our perceptions, experiences, and constitutions of that world. It's important to recognize queer desires as occurring not only within, but also with the natural environment. In a queer ecopolitics, the attractions, compulsions, and repulsions among plants, animals, minerals would all receive recognition and consideration. A number of members of the neo-pagan movement were particularly sensitive to such configuration of the environment as itself a living network, with humans not operating with the superiority of semi-autonomous stewards, but often acting collectively and unconsciously through the flows and stresses of the system throughout which they are permeated. And now I'd just like to turn this idea of a queer ecology, which I think is still theoretically in the process of being articulated by these scholars, and see how it works with three individuals writing during the time period that we're most interested. And what button should I press to make this happen?
Just do this here.
Great. Thank you. In 1888, the year that the Occult Society, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, was founded, the artist Mina Bergson, Henry Bergson's sister, became its first initiate. She changed her name to the Gallic Moina, and in 1890 married the order's co-founder, Samuel Mathers. I know that this is familiar to most of you. By the time they had moved to Paris, he had fashioned himself Count MacGregor, a Scottish gentleman of fortune, as one of the journalists wrote, although the man was in fact not a Scot, not a count, and not wealthy. Indeed, he and Moina started performing the rites of Isis in public in order to make ends meet. Moina saw these rituals as part of a woman-centered paganism. The feminist concerns underlying her vision of ancient Egyptian paganism are apparent in her critiques of the marginalization of the priestess in contemporary religion. When a religion symbolizes the universe by a divine being, she argues in an interview conducted by Frederick Lees, isn't it illogical to omit women, who is the principal half of it, since she is the principal creator of the other half, that is man, so man and woman is equal, but women are more equal, I think is her argument. Mathers's claim is not simply for the inclusion of a goddess within religion, but for the primacy of the female spirit, because as biological mothers, females are the principal creators on the planet. Moreover, for her, woman finds her force in her alliance with the sympathetic energies of nature. So a denial of Isis constitutes the devaluation of sympathy for and sense of contiguity with the natural realm. In Mathers' model, it's not woman as human, but as a force of nature that marks her as innately divine. Mathers grants moral standing to flora and fauna and the planet, but her ethical extensionism is complicated by her vision of the earth as a mother, a view that reinscribes procreative heteronormativity and an anthropocentric ethical vision into a history of pagan spiritualities that have historically often been protean and disruptive. And yet, for Mathers, woman is the magician born of nature by reason of her great natural sensibility and of her instructive sympathy with such subtle energies as these intelligent inhabitants of the air, the earth, the fire, and water. While structurally in accord with the Golden Dawn's conception of the spiritual realm as natural, amorphic, and powerful, Mathers proposes that these principal qualities are in accord also with the constitution of women in particular. That said, in the order of the Golden Dawn, one is not born a magician. The occult society defined its key function to be the complex initiation, memorization, testing, training required for the practice of natural magic, a tenet to which Mathers herself adhered. Her ecofeminism resides, therefore, not in a view of woman as goddess or the earth as mother, but in the belief that women's procreative potential reflected their stronger disposition for natural magic. She does problematically venerate women as an ideal spiritual force. However, her formulation of the force as part of a natural ecology angles at least somewhat toward a potential devaluation of the human within the matrix of effective forces. Another member of the Golden Dawn, Scottish author William Sharp, engages with the same problem of idealizing woman, but his spiritually romantic rendering of an eco-pagan feminism more richly envisions a politics of trans-species desires. In his time, Sharp was best known for sweeping romantic sagas in which female characters are idealized as spiritual entities. As I imagine many of you know, they were written under a pseudonym of Fiona McLeod, when he and his wife quite successfully hiding his real identity until Sharp's death. Her novel, The Mountain Lovers, was put out in, I'm saying her for a while, and then I switched back to he because that's what he did. Her novel, The Mountain Lovers, was put out in 1895 by John Lane, who was enjoying a strong, if somewhat notorious, reputation for publishing authors invested in decadence, neo-paganism, and the occult, including various members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, including Sharp. Mountain Lovers appeared in the Keynote series, inspired by George Edgerton's feminist eco-pagan short story collection, Keynotes. The hyper-romantic narrative of Mountain Lovers portrays the life of a golden-haired woman named Una, who could not be more enmeshed in the landscape. She was like the spirit of woodland loneliness, and absolutely one with nature, as though she were a dancing sunbeam, or the brief embodiment of the joy of the wind. And it goes on like this for hundreds of pages, but you get it. The following year, MacLeod's 1896 Highland romance Green Fire offers a similar declaration of impassioned transmutation. What the seedlings feel in the brown mold, what the sap feels in the trees, what the blood feels in every creature from the newt in the pool to the nesting bird, so feels the strange remembering ichor, that is blood, that runs its red tides through human hearts and brains. This novel's idealized heroine, meanwhile, is to be understood as an eco-spirit itself, at once a child of nature, a beautiful pagan, a daughter of the sun, at once this and a soul alive with a spiritual life. Indeed, the mysticism which was part of the spiritual inheritance come with her northern strain. Like MacLeod's heroines, Sharp spent most of his career reflecting a sense of himself as sensually engaged in the lives of animals, plants, and the elements. I suppose I was a gypsy once, he speculates in his memoirs, a wild man before, a wilder beast of prey before that. He speculates a lot on what he was before he was a modern man with breathing problems. I'm not sure if I've kept up with my slides. That's Moina and Samuel dressed for the rites of Isis at the Baudelaire Theatre. They were doing public, this is where they were making their money. They were attached to Crowley, as most of you know at this point, and they were having trouble with the English folks under Florence Farr who weren't, well, Annie Horniman and others who weren't prepared to send them money all the time. There's our William Sharp, aka Fiona McLeod. In an 1880s letter describing a day in Rome, Sharp writes, "I revel in this summer gorgeousness and drink in the hot breath of the earth as though it were the breath of life." You're going to see breath and breathing coming up a lot in his writing because of, in part because of the problems he had breathing. With below all that strange smell as of the very body of the living, breathing world. In another letter in which he describes the fecund fruit season of southern Germany, Sharp takes in a strange smell as of the very body of the living, breathing world. The only sounds, he tells us, were from the myriad bees and wasps and butterflies, some peasants singing in the valley as they trimmed the vines, and the just audible susurrus of the wind among the highest pines. While the descriptions became increasingly sensual, his heavy turn to rhythm and the assonance of susurrus implies his own bodily engagement with the ecology. By the end of the scene, the author is left satisfied, intoxicated, and electrified in mind and body. While the insects and peasants' energies are naturalized as harmonious productivity, however, Sharp's own engagement here is recuperative, the poet drawing energy from the productivity of others. I seemed to inhale it, to drink it in, to absorb it at every pore, to become it, to become the heart and soul within it. The author's most innovative rendering of this permeation of himself into the sensorium can be found in the 1891 poetry collection Sospiri di Roma. And here, the female again moves forward. Writing to his friend John Elder in October 1880, Sharp describes sospiri as a spiritual breath, a force that passes through all things, like a vague wind blowing through intricate forests. In the poem Fiori de Memoria, Memories, Flowers, or The Best of Memories, Sharp represents this eco-spiritual relationship as the marriage of the landscape and a female deity, a mountain girl. The poem, the longest in Sospiro di Roma, opens with a vividly decadent rendering of difficult breathing. From the swamp, the white mist stealeth, wendeth slowly through the grasses. Like a long lithe snake it circleth, breathing from its mouth its poison, breathing fumes of the malaria. This serpentine sentence of tangled wording relies for whatever propulsion it musters on sibilance and the repetition of the word breathing. The description continues in long, rather floppy phrasing characterized by inaction as the mist becomes a thin white snake that just as quickly turns into a veil of smoke that eventually enters a hollow of timeless ruin. Not above, but the blue hollow with its infinite depth of azure, not to meet the wandering vision, but the ruins mid the grasses. Nothing is seen around but grasses, flower-filled grasses. I keep thinking of Walt Whitman because Leaves of Grass, he was apparently the last person in Britain to see Walt Whitman alive. I don't know how many British people saw him dead, but apparently he was the last one to see Whitman alive, and he does reference Whitman a lot, and so all these grasses seem to me to be speaking to Whitman's work. The stasis, the sense of stymied imagination, the lack of propulsion reinforced by the panting rhythm, all work to evoke the sense. See this heat in this room? I did this. This was all part of my plan to just make you feel really weary and have the difficulty to breathe that Sharp was living with much of his life. Evoke the sense of an individual outdoors looking to the landscape for inspiration. Now, William Hallardon has argued that this vagueness and inertia is a weakness in Sharp's early poetry, but I would suggest that for the poet himself, it reflects an evanescence that is a key element of his poetics, of a de-individuated spiritualism where the spirit is able to reside in diverse landscapes and beings simultaneously. So I'm interested in this dissipation of the self into the landscape that's going on here. Now, only after 4 pages of this kind of impressionist, he wrote all his poetry outdoors. He was writing in plein air. He was this impressionist sketching. Does the narrator promisingly encounter a wild mountain girl? The reader's itch for action, however, some sort of narrative propulsion, is unfulfilled, as the naked woman is destined to spend the entire poem asleep in a rose bush. In the course of the poem, nothing in the environment really changes. Nothing, that is, but the narrator's experience of breathing the landscape, or as he puts it in his letter, of seeming to inhale it, to drink it in, to absorb it at every pore, to become it. While personified as heterosexual and human, the overriding eros is ecological, with the female figure, as in McLeod's novels, embodying the interpermeability that Sharp felt with the landscape, the representation of the female as the changeable relations dissipating through the components of the landscape became a mainstay of Sharp's writing. Although highly romanticized, his efforts do capture the trans-species quality of affections, affirming a polydesirous permeability, even if also relying on a conventional model characterized by passivity and subjugation. So I've got one more author, Vernon Lee, to talk about. It's the last one. And just before I start her, it's like, when I get to the end of each of these, I'm kind of thinking, like, how, if in any way, is this queer? Or is it just an essentialist feminist kind of value? And so while in Moyna Mathers, her focus is on the lack of women's agency in relationship to her very dynamic and forceful husband. And so one gets a very little feel for that. But I feel in Sharp, there a much stronger sense that he's not really particularly interested in the nubile mountain girl in the rose bush, as in getting a sense, as in creating a sense of his relationship with the landscape. And this is especially because he's writing most of this stuff outdoors, in the weather, trying to be one with the space, all that sort of thing. And so with Vernon Lee, I think we get perhaps the most promising of three examples. And I was looking for people dealing with different types of paganism. So the Egyptian goddesses, the Scottish or Celtic forces. And then Lee goes to classical notions of the genius loci. This same investment in the affective landscape can be found in the last author I wish to discuss today, Vernon Lee, whose writing, which, while keenly rooted in the classical notion of the genius loci, offers a more pragmatic and less idealistic rendering of a polysensual worldview. Working in the 1880s and 1890s with her romantic partner, the Scottish neo-pagan Clementina Anstruther Thompson, the two proposed that individuals engaged emotionally with objects and their ecological contexts, a claim that Lee extended in her writing on the genius loci. Her 1904 essay, Motor Cars and the Genius of Places, falls somewhere between an early manifesto of the slow movement and a sort of Ratty's denunciation of the calamitous driving adventures of Toad in Wind in the Willows. In motoring, she writes, things remain ocular, mere visions, unoccupied by the sympathizing measure of our muscles and will. They lack the tangible joy working deep into our nerves of the massive real, of complete possession working deep into the soul, which belongs to desires that struggle for their accomplishment. How poignantly, pathetically almost, we feel the lines and colors of the hills remaining forever on the horizon. I like here how Lee describes the massive real as a product of desire and possession of the soul, a term Sharp repeatedly evokes in his conflation of soul, breath, and spirit in the metaphor of suspiri. The tactile experience for Lee is necessary for an emphatic relationship that extends not only through the body, but into the psychological and spiritual, permeating one's desires. The key concern with traveling in motor cars is the inability to embody or become embodied by the aesthetic, a problem that she establishes as the difference between sight and touch. Lee's formulation inverts, I'm just skipping a little section here, Lee's formulation inverts the vision created by priest and geologist Antonio Stoppani, who invented the notion of the Anthropocene in 1862. He referred to it as the Anthropozoic age as opposed to the Anthropocenic age, but he's looked at it as the person who first articulated the concept. In 1862, to describe the first geological era marked by human influence. Stepani describes modern botanists as vehemently searching the furthest depths into mountain fissures on the highest peaks for the untamed daughters of virgin nature that carry unaltered the features of their mother. Stepani gleefully observes the way in which the rise of a Christian Anthropocene has ancient nature distort itself, almost flee under the heel of this new nature. I'm really keen about the idea that the Anthropocene, you all hear about the Anthropocene a lot right now, and that this model of the Anthropocene is actually rooted in the idea of Christianity pushing paganism kind of out of its position of authority. So the scientific language that we keep hearing about actually has its roots in this amazing sort of pagan politics that's going on. And that's how Stepani first envisions the articulation. Of course, there's many other models now. So for Lee, the intrusion of contemporary human values brings to light the indifference to a sensual paganism that is in fact overriding the modern moment's infatuation with technological speed and efficiency. In her 1892 collection of essays, Genius Loci, Notes on Place, Lee recognizes what she refers to as the nobler paganism. Dedicating Genius Loci, another Lane publication, to people, not to people, but to trees, Lee observes that locales can touch us like living creatures, and one can have with them friendship of the deepest and most satisfying sort. Stepani has similarly turned to a rhetoric of natural spirit in his efforts to articulate the soul of the Anthropocene. However, while his efforts to capture the geologic moment lead to his rendering of nature's natural locations as mythic characters prancing around the mountaintops, Lee adamantly argues against such anthropomorphizing gestures. We know that Sharp has pagan creatures laying in rose bushes in the mountaintops as well. Lee speaks against this. She goes, here then is also a point of distinction that we have to keep in mind. For mercy's sake, not a personification, Lee riles, not a man or a woman with mural crown and attributes and detestable, definite history. To think of a place or a country in human shape is, for all the practice of rhetoricians, not to think of it at all. Lee is explicitly challenging the common tendency to envision spirituality as a fixed anthropocentric phenomena. While repeated visits to a particular location can result in a sense of the spirit of the place, each experience itself is never more than a fleeting, sensual engagement. As she writes, a mere amour de voyage, in the most worthy sense, where though the remembrance may be long, the actual moment of meeting, now we have met, we are safe, as Whitman says, is necessarily very brief. Whitman's poem that Lee cites, Out of the Rolling Ocean, the Crowd, describes a lover as a drop of water that, momentarily individualized, is able to voice its desire. I have traveled a long way merely to look on you, to touch you. Now we have met, we've looked, we're safe. Return in peace to the ocean, my love. I too am part of that ocean, my love. We're not so much separated. The image can be read as a one-night stand, an amour de voyage, as Lee puts it. But what Lee wishes to emphasize is that in Whitman's formulation, the encounter is all the more precious because of its evanescence. A particular point of intensity occurring within the oceanic commingling of all sentient beings, the crowd. So polygamy, not monogamy. Behold the great rondure, suggests the lover in Whitman's piece, the cohesion of all, how perfect. In accord with the poem, the Genius Loci elicits in Lee well-nigh passionate and certainly romantic feelings, her language becoming particularly erotic at this point, just as she's about to end her study. And it's the very decentering of the human in the erotic experience that, Lee says, makes them only the more honorable, precluding jealousy, fatuity, and every bitterness. And certainly, to my mind, more really romantic. So in my talk today, I've turned to various contributions to the neo-pagan movement to sketch out Victorian visions of what we today might call a queer eco-politics. I'm not totally convinced I did that. That's what I was trying to do. But that's what I've been trying to point out is, it's I guess it's on a spectrum. Plumwood, in her more recent efforts to envision a feminism that displaces binaristic logic with a more dispersed relational politics of affection, calls the conception an interspecies communicative ethic. And the diverse contributors to the kind of popular paganism movement, I suggest, offer an important complement to broader Victorian ecological models, turning to earth-based spirituality to challenge the gendered and speciesist violence of a modern industrial economy that fails to consider the earth as a desirous network of trans-species inter-reliance. Thank you.